James swallowing horse, all his liars to force, violence is every end, Leon beware.
Okay, so that looks good. Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back to my channel. And I'm delighted today. I have the amazing James Swallow is back with me. Hi, James.
Hey, good to be back.
Thank you. And I've tempted you back to talk about Liar's Due, which is a short story from Age of Darkness. I've already apologized to James for kind of, all these authors. I'm like, can you cast your mind back to decades and decades ago? This was first published in 2011, and it's heresy adjacent. In fact, it's quite far away from all the core events you've been right in the center of. And I just wondered, do you remember like how this came about, or how you decided this was the story you would be given? Yeah, how did that process all work?
I think that at the time, like you say, we've been doing a lot of stuff that was like right knee deep in the heresy and the blood and thunder of it all. And so when the opportunity came to do a short story, I thought, well, can I do something that's not that? That just for my own sense and sanity, just instead of writing some bolter porn, can I do something that still feels a heresy story that contributes meaningfully to that narrative, but does not have, all of the massive sort of thud and blunder and sort of huge galaxy changing events, but still feels big in its own kind of way. And so once I had that idea, how do I do a small story that feels large? That was the sort of the germ of the idea of this. And I started thinking about like the nature of the heresy being such a huge thing, is
Mm.
this galaxy spanning conflict. And but by the sheer nature of the size of it, the battle can't be everywhere because there's just not enough space marines and starships to go around. It's like, there are going to be places out on the fringe who never see the war. And I thought, well, what would it be like to live on one of those places? And it comes back to a point. Remember back when we were talking about Nemesis, and I talked to you about the idea of Joe Hive City, the
Yes.
mythological guy who's the regular citizen living in the Warhammer universe while all the crazy stuff is happening. This is another kind of aspect of that, is what it's like to be a regular, ordinary person
Mm.
under the shadow of all of these colossal sort of like demigods blowing the hell out of each other. But all of that's kind of going along in the same sort of mix. And
Yeah.
I had this idea about how would Horus's forces take over planets that were out on the periphery where they couldn't afford to send starships? Of course, well, how do you do that? You do that through subterfuge, and who does subterfuge best? That's an Alpha Legion thing. So immediately I'm like, oh, okay, so it's going to be the Alpha Legion who are going to be the villains of the piece.
Mm.
How can I make, but it's not going to be Space Marines. It's not going to be Space Marines coming down out of the sky and drop pods and, tanks rolling across the wilderness. It's going to be subtle. It's going to be playing with hearts and minds. It's going to be turning people against each other, which of course is a microcosm of what the whole Horus Heresy is about, chaos messing with people. And the more I kind of dove into this idea, I thought the more I liked it because it felt like it reflected the bigger story of the heresy on a small scale. I really love that in fiction, not just in my own stuff, but in books that I read. I love where the micro story reflects the macro story and vice versa, where themes that are big themes can be small themes, that a story about a planet destroying war can be huge and destructive, but also the story about maybe like one guy on a street corner getting shot can be equally destructive to just
Mm.
one person's life. Your whole world can be destroyed by a single bullet, not just your
Yeah.
entire city being planned. So all of those themes were all at play when I was putting the story together.
Yeah, I'm just going to look at my notes, James, because I feel like I was going to try and summarize, but it's actually really, really good to hear from you because that note about, I think I spoke to you the last time we were together. I did say to you, oh, I'd love some more slice of life or, what it's like to be Joe, Hive City. And having read the short story as you've described it, I don't know that I do because, as you're bringing it back to life, The way the seeds of doubt were planted in the story, and you see this town kind of functioning, and then all of a suddenly not functioning, and the divisions. And we see through the eyes of Leon, who I thought really matched me up in my character. I was Leon, naive and, oh, Space Marines are shiny and wonderful. And I thought that was really well done. I mean, there were so many elements of this story that I just thought was peak James Swallow. There was like very gentle world building. There were these really lovely fleshed out characters that you really cared about. And then there was just this very quiet, you were aware behind the doors things were moving, and this stranger comes to town, and you're getting a little bit of backstory here and there. And then wham, at the end, you find out, this disruptive infiltrator really, it just turned everything upside down. Sorry, so that's the bit where I tell you how wonderful you are.
Thank
And
you.
when
That's
I, there'll be more of that to come. When I was a very little mini, I used to steal my dad's sci-fi books. And one that left a really indelible impression upon me was one, I've written it down, Wasp by Eric Frank Russell. And it was like basically a very deep, it was someone who was planted so deep in an alien world society that no one could have suspected. And I felt this had the real hallmarks of not only classic sci-fi, but also classic Cold War, which I also, that whole kind of spy theme that you do so well. How do you sit so happily in these two genres? Like, where does that come from? And the planning and the visualization? Because I think that's quite hard to write. Like, you're writing a mystery backwards almost.
Well, I've always loved spy stories. And yeah, you make a great point there about the kind of there's a thread of sort of Cold War espionage kind of stuff going on there. I drew a lot of inspiration from reading about the Stasi in East Germany, and the way that they would kind of manipulate people and manipulate information in order to sort of keep their hold on things during the height of the Cold War.
Mm.
And there's definitely, degrees of that coming out there. But there's also stuff kind of harking back to the sort of propaganda broadcasts of World War II. You got the famously Lord Haw, the guy who would broadcast Germany calling, and he would broadcast these things. But also, they have there was Tokyo Rose broadcasting to the Americans, and Hanoi Hannah during the Vietnam War. The idea of these kind of evil DJs almost, just kind
Yeah.
of broadcasting this kind of stuff. And there's a little nod to that, So the story, when the message from the heart of the Imperium turns up, it begins with a voice saying, "This is the Imperium calling," and that was me deliberately kind of
Ah, yes.
that idea. And there's also I also drew from the famous story about the War of the Worlds broadcast, the Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast. That was a radio play, the Mercury Theatre doing this radio play of their adaptation of the H.G. Wells story, and
Mm.
people tuning into it halfway through, and they thought they were listening to the real news, and that a Martian UFO had landed in Grover's Mill, New Jersey, and the tripods were on the march.
Yeah.
And people were genuinely terrified because that was the only way they received information back then, through
Yeah.
the radio. So they trusted it. And you can ask, well, you look at the situation that we're in now with social media, and you can say, like, can you trust what you're being told? And all of these
Right.
questions are at play in this. So in a way, this story feels even more timely now than it did, 15 odd years ago when I wrote it.
Yeah.
So I was trying to pull from all of those different places. And another really big inspiration for this story is one of my favorite episodes of The Twilight Zone. Is
Oh,
a
which
great
episode?
episode. It's called The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. And
Okay.
it's just a terrific story. And I have to say, this story in a lot of ways is very much my love letter to that episode of that show. I always loved The Twilight Zone. A sidebar here to say, I think it's terrific writing. The original black and white show, really great economy of storytelling, just really hits the mark and has some great twists in the tale. And
Mm.
in Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, it's a very similar idea about a small town that has a power cut, and everybody in the town, everybody on the street just starts to turn on each other because they think that aliens are invading because some little boy read a book about flying saucers.
Yeah.
And these people are trying to destroy each other. And the great twist, I'm going to blow the ending of it now, but at the end, the lights come back on, and everybody goes, "Oh, it was just a power cut," you know.
Yeah.
And then the camera pulls back, and there's two aliens standing on top of a hill going, and one of them turns to the other. And I remember he has this great line of dialogue where he says, "Do you understand the procedure now?" And he says, "This is how we will to invade this planet. All we need to do is turn their power off, and they will kill each other for us." You know, and I
Oh,
like that sort of double twist in it. So
yeah. Well,
all of those elements, that stew of ideas, you know, was all kind of coming together. And it felt like to me something that really speaks strongly to the Warhammer world, because it is a world of lies and distrust, and it is a world of where all these things are being obfuscated. And that's very Warhammer 40,000, not exactly Horus Heresy, because, you know, we always talk about the heresy being this bright, shining example of what can be, then that's tragically lost. And it becomes the sort of gritty, grim, dark version of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. He goes down that sort of like, you know, down the drain, as it were. And
yeah.
so in this story, I want to show kind of the sense of that starting to happen is that there are these people living on this planet in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of these like you know endless fields of grain. If you've ever seen pictures of sort of like the farms in Kansas, where it's just like this long flat forever of fields of grain, that's kind of how I visualized what this world would look like. And these people are just living their lives, you know, for good or ill. And then this one external force comes over and just absolutely rips their world to pieces
Mm.
with radio, and just, you know, just with manipulating the media turns these people on each other. And their whole society breaks down in a matter of days. And it was just a compelling, a really compelling idea. And I felt when I was writing it, the energy of the idea just propelled me through the whole thing.
It's so great to hear about all these different references and influences because for a short story, it feels like it has a lot of that standing behind it. And where when you describe you wanted to let people kind of see how things were slowly getting worse. I mean, the whole compilation is called Age of Darkness, and I was complaining this is a fantastic collection of stories that just is describing how everything's slowly going to shit. And you've taken us to this very remote planet. But really, I mean, it felt like there was so much weight because obviously we've all read about all the horrible things that are happening to see it play out on Virger-Mos. And yeah, I completely got the fields of corn and how isolated and traveling from village to village, took days and things like this. So really felt, all those things at play. Yeah, and I definitely get Twilight Zone vibes as well. There was like on the face of it, like just a normal village, but what's going on in the background. I mean,
Also add as well, another element that's just I remembered that I thought of at the time was I was trying to hark back to kind of some of those slightly weird 1970s westerns, especially if you've ever watched not the Outlaw Josie Wales. That's a Clint Eastwood one. It's not Pale Rider. Can't remember the name of it now. There's a western with Clint Eastwood where he basically comes into this town,
yeah.
and again it's the man with no name type thing, and he turns this town against itself. And there's a kind of mystical element to it. Is it suggested that maybe he's the ghost of a guy that got killed, that the townsfolk let this happen, and now he's kind of a
Wow.
spirit of vengeance come back to destroy them. Oh, it's driving me crazy now. I can't think of the title of it. But that was a very strong influence on it as well, doing this sort of kind of small town,
Yeah.
dark Western thing to it. And it was funny to me when the audio book was done, the guy who did the voice reading for it did it as a small town, but like in Cornwall. So everybody else, so instead of, I expected him to have like kind of cowboy accents, but he did everybody as it was all kind of like, we're out in the fields getting into corn, and I was like, oh, okay, you're going that way with it. That's cool.
Wow.
But it
That's
gives it a completely different vibe, which is a lot of fun.
That is cool. I think that would make it even creepier thinking about, folk horror and all of that. I mean, I really love the weight of all your influences coming in because there's something in the reading of it that feels like this is a really established place. These things could really be happening. I kind of enjoyed, but really, in a way that was unsettling. Leon's father is not a happy camper. The absence of Leon's mother. And again, it's like thinking about like the Joe Hive family. my heart went out to Leon. So there was this kind of dynamic. I don't know if sometimes I push a lot of myself into these books, but Esquire Mendix allows the boy to kind of like interact with him. And, I felt like there was a fondness that Leon had for this person that would then turn out to be a betrayer. It was kind of like family dynamic writing. We saw the dejection and the upset of the boy having a father like Ames, and then, potentially this other person. And at the end of the book, I was thinking, maybe would Leon leave the planet to be with Mendax and maybe have nicer treatment? But I know, I should know by now.
Warhammer, it's not going to end. It's never going to have a happy ending.
No, I know. Well, that's my slash fan fiction, obviously. I just rewrite and they lived happily ever after. But where did the thought for that little family unit of the dad and the son, the disillusioned dad and the hopeful son, and then the absent mum come from? Or did you just pop that in to tug at my heartstrings?
Yeah, it's definitely me trying to create a character there that everybody will feel sympathetic for because it's Leon's story.
Yeah.
And it's and where we're experiencing the distant heresy and the closer sort of collapse of his personal society, and we see it through that kid's eyes. And you know I wanted to make him feel like he's a Warhammer fanboy, right? I deliberately made
Yes.
jokes about that, right? He's like, he's got his collection of miniatures,
Yeah,
and
I even wrote here, he has his Insignium Astartes book, and I
yeah,
looked up and it exists.
that is a real book, right? And that I deliberately put that in there. So yes, I had a copy of the Insignium Astartes, which is this great sort of big coffee table book that has all like the artwork and the heraldry of the Space Marines, and it feels like an in-universe document. So I
Mm,
thought, well, what he'd have a copy of that, and I was looking at my own life as a kid,
yeah.
growing up with the things that I was a fan of, and how I had a few books and stuff like that. I lived in a little flat, and we didn't have a lot of space, and we didn't have a lot of money, so the stuff that I had was really precious to me.
Mm,
And I can remember having books about, Star Trek and and Star Wars and all those kind of things, and rereading these things so many times that the pages would fall apart, and they were so really, really precious to me. And I wanted to put a little bit of that in there to it as well. So he has the whole thing where he's got his little miniatures that he's painted up. So hopefully everybody reading this is like kind of, oh, he's like me, because I'm a
yeah.
Warhammer fan, I'm painting my miniatures. And he has that one item that's like his pride and joy, which is the bolt shell,
Mm.
which may or may not actually be the real thing.
Well, yeah, you take that away from him. He's like, this was never near a space marine, and you're like, Leon, no.
But you don't. But the thing is you don't know. It's like, and there's that whole scene where his dad kind of comes into the room, and it's like his dad is this man who's lost the woman he loved, right? And you can, although that's never kind of articulated explicitly in the story, his dad's kind of broken by the life that he has, and I think on some sort of level, he probably knows Leon's doomed to the same kind of life, and there's nothing he can do about it. So his dad's got a lot of directionless energy and anger that he can't express.
Yeah.
And so he looks at his son and he's like, why are you wasting your life with all of this stuff?
Mm.
The Emperor doesn't care about you. These people, the spacemen, they don't care about you. There's nothing you can do to connect with that world. It's like you're wasting your time. But whereas Leon is sort of, I want to grow beyond this world. His
Yeah.
dad is saying, no, 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 stay, lower your focus. Don't
Yeah.
look high, look down, because there's no point in doing it. So there's these two energies kind of pulling at each other, and neither of them are communicating it very well. And I thought that felt to me like really true. It feels like a real kind of family dynamic. And then into this
Mm.
comes Mendax,
Yeah.
uh, and that's a joke right there. His name Mendax, which is a corruption of Mendax, which
Mendacity.
Mendacity, basically
Oh,
he is liar, right? So
yeah,
he
yeah,
is,
yeah.
he's the exemplar of that. And in comes Mendax, and this guy who is his job, right, is to inveigle his way into every society he goes to, no matter what planet it is, no matter what culture it is, his skill is to just worm his way in. And there's a scene when he goes into the bar the first time, into the saloon, and he buys a drink and he's listening to the way the men around him are talking, and he modifies his accent to make him sound a bit more like them so they'll be more ready to accept him. So he's got a bit of a posh accent. And he's like, oh, I'll dial that back a bit, make
Yeah.
myself sound a bit more like a kind of common or garden bloke because I'll get in better with these guys. And he sees Leon as Leon is almost to him, it's like Leon's the key to the whole thing because he realizes that through the boy, he's going to find the key to undoing all of this because the kid is such a pure kind of guileless example of that whole society. And he's like, yeah, I can use what I learned from you to bring the entire world down. And he looks at Leon and Ames's relationship, and he sees what Leon is missing. Is Leon wants a mentor, a father figure who's going to be uplifting for him. So he gives him that, even though it's all in the service of this darker cause. He just goes, he looks at that and just says, yeah, I can abuse and use this to my own evil ends. And that's the great tragedy of the story is this kid, he's so desperate for someone to give him a bit of approval. And when he
Mm.
gets it, he doesn't realize that the guy he's got great admiration for is actually there to destroy his whole world.
Yeah. I mean, I thought that was so beautifully done, and each of those characters is so, so well fleshed out. Even, there's a lot of feelings of ennui and isolation from missing the mum, but seeing the effects on the where they used to live, and the astropath who's up in her pod, completely on their own. All the villages are so separated, and then for Mendax to come in. And even though you're like, oh God, he's awful, he's going to be a real baddie, you see in Leon's excitement the energy, and yeah. So I thought that was really clever, but terrible writing, Mr. Swallow, breaking our hearts again.
I'm really pleased though that you kind of picked up on because the theme of the isolation, that to me was something that I tried to kind of layer that in.
Mm.
That's right down there in the base and in the foundation of the story is the idea of I think if when society fragments like that, when communities are isolated from each other, it's all down to communication, right? If they'd had more ways to communicate, they wouldn't have been so susceptible to misinformation.
Yeah.
And that's kind of at the heart of it. I mean, this was when I was writing this story a few years earlier. My parents had moved out to the country to a very small village.
Mm.
When I visited, I was really struck by how small the scope of what people who lived there talked about, as they didn't really talk about stuff like beyond the next kind of hill. And it's like, there's a whole world out there, right, of other stuff going on. And
Mm.
while it's nice to kind of have, a small community, and there's pluses and minuses to it, is that you get the strength of community in a small group. But I feel like you lose a little bit of that far distant horizon. And so again, that's something else. It's another thread I was trying to pull into this is saying that, if you're in an isolated community and you never look beyond that, you're going to be susceptible to people who want to manipulate that, perhaps not for the best of ends.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely picked up. I never pick up till the end, and I'm thinking about my questions, but I'm like, I would be reading it on a train on quite a sunny day, but I had an unsettling sense of stillness or dislocation because there were these very quiet, dark moments, lots of reflection within the book. And I'm always in awe of writers who can, you don't even realize you're being gently placed in these states of mind. But yeah, the isolation, I just thought the world building really lent to that. I was thinking if there was a soundtrack, it'd probably be like that band Air did for Virgin Suicide, very sparse and lonely. But yeah, I think it was very powerful for the placing of it to be so. It really kind of set a tone and a feeling of melancholy for the beginning of this book. So it was like coming back to an old friend that you dread sitting and hearing from, but you also love. So yeah, that was really lovely.
I
Yeah,
remember, by the way, the title of that Clint Eastwood movie. It's High Plains Drifter.
High
Is the
Plains Drifter.
that was a strong influence on that.
And
That it's in a way that's kind of like I said, that's got a quasi horror, quasi fantasy element to it. And it's when you often think of stories that are psychological horror, they're obviously visually dark and grim. And I tried to think of this as if it was the movie, it would actually be quite brightly lit. It would be bright colors, like open fields and sunshine. You know,
yeah,
with all this kind of darkness happening inside it.
Wow. I mean, I'm going to have to watch that movie now, but I'm guessing it's not a happy ending, James? No?
But it does feel, it does it is one of those kind of stories. It's like if you liked reading that story and you like Warhammer, I think it's the kind of thing that it's one of those kind of weird fantasy westerns that does feel in an odd way Warhammer adjacent, you know? If
Yeah.
you if you've read those kind of stories, you could believe, you could watch High Plains Drifter and think it was happening on some planet in the Imperium, because there are these worlds that are so far off the beaten track, is they've never seen a space marine, they're so far away. There's like one astropath and a town somewhere, and the rest of it is just fields of grain being harvested.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Thank goodness we live in such pleasant times here on planet Earth. We don't. It's all the same. It's all the same now. Um, yeah, I also love the conceit of like the sky hooks and the town had like even numbers. It's like town 44, you're just one of the, it's kind of going over to this, we're not quite seeing the servitor grey hives on this planet. But, the father even goes out of his way to say to the son, they don't need us humans here. We are easily replaceable. They have us here, but if they didn't need us to, everything could be automated. And I was thinking, oh, it's that kind of precursor of, going from these kind of rural communities with loads of crops to, the grey planet's completely spent, everything's mechanized. So I felt that really added to the, as you were saying, the beginning of the 40K, that all that horrible stuff's coming in.
Yeah, you can see all the root. This is showing in a lot of different ways, hopefully, all the roots of that dark and nasty stuff that's coming and
Yeah.
hitting the very beginnings of it.
And I think this is quite a privileged place to read on because all the, the big money in the heresy and 40K is the big stories and the blowing everything up. So the fact that we get this kind of collection, it's quite unique, it really kind of fills in those gaps of what it must be like to experience going through it.
Yeah, I mean, because if you look back at the period when we were writing this, we had a greater degree of freedom then, because I think at that point we hadn't decided how long it was going to be, and we were feeling the pressure to kind of, obviously we were always from the very beginning, we had a pressure to kind of tell the stories that people were expecting and deliver the narrative that people thought we were going to deliver. But earlier on, we had a bit more room to breathe, and we kind of lost that, to be honest, towards the end, because as we kind of rushed towards the ending of the heresy, it became more about the big stuff and
Yeah,
more about kind of hitting those big markers. But at this earlier point, we had the opportunity to do weird little fun stuff around the fringes.
yeah,
I always talk about The Last Church is a really brilliant example of that kind of story,
oh yeah,
which, it's a tiny little moment in the greater scheme of things, but it has such impact on the larger scope of the world,
mm,
even though, it's just a very small event, but
yeah,
it has thematically and resonantly the echo of that story kind of carries out through the entire Horus Heresy. And in a small way, I wanted to do that with this story. It's not an important story about important people or an important planet. It's just about it's a little slice of life of an everyday moment in the heresy. And in its way, that is important because it illustrates the baseline regular Joe view of the Horus Heresy, which can sometimes get lost when, it's Titans smashing through cities and, planet destroying bombs. Sometimes we can lose scope and we can lose focus on that. The Horus Heresy is about the common man just as much as it is about Primarchs and Space Marines.
yeah. Wow. No, I think we're so lucky. I mean, in 2011, I probably would have been like, but what happens next? But now being able to kind of go through this, I feel, yeah, it's as you said, that you had more breathing space. And also I learned from Christian Dunn that there was a magazine called Inferno. There were other opportunities for short writing to come out, short stories, I should say, outside of like the codex. There were places where these stories could emerge and come out. Whereas now, I mean, I'm not really up with it, but I don't know if there is, if it's all just kind of channeled into novels now rather than magazines, for example, or, short
Well,
story
I mean, there are the e-shorts collections that you see coming out there and the little quick reads.
Yeah,
That kind of fulfills a similar-ish sort of space, you know. I mean, Inferno was like the in a way it was the kind of that was the on-ramp for a lot of us who are Warhammer writers because it was where you kind of went to audition, you know, so you'd do a short story there. That's exactly how it happened for me, is I did a couple of stories, and then they said, you know, you get the universe, do you want to do a novel for us? And then that parlayed me into doing the Blood Angels books. But the great thing about short fiction is as a writer, you get to exercise different set of muscles by doing it.
yeah.
Whereas if you write an epic big story, you know, you've got to juggle a lot of balls and you've got a lot of different characters and there's a lot of things you have to do. But with a short story, sometimes you experimental and you can play around with form and structure and narrative and you can tell a kind of story that maybe you wouldn't be able to sustain over 100,000 word book, but 7 to 10,000 word story gives you room to kind of play with the form a little bit, and that's what makes it really fun to do.
I mean, I feel so, I keep saying I feel lucky, but you having to write in a short story, I really feel I got like, it's like when you drink Ribena straight from the bottle. I got essential. It was
Concentrate.
such a strong hit of James Swallow. And I just thought that's so bloody brilliant because it just shows the power of an author to just quickly, that could be in one train ride and you come to your station in a completely different state of mind. And also I feel a bit like I bet I would have really loved it if I could have had something like Inferno, collections of your favorite packed in together in this short magazine and knowing other people around you all had it at the same time. So yeah, it's great that I'm getting to catch up on this. I'm feeling nostalgia for something I was never even a part of. I don't know how that's possible,
It
but
was a great, it was, yeah, it was a great thing because, you know, Inferno would have like two or three short stories, a couple of comics in there. I
oh
do miss it. You know, it was a fun sort of thing because it's like a lot of these publications, you pick it up. It's like going to the buffet, right? You don't know what you're going to get.
yeah.
Yeah, and there might be something there you don't want to eat. That's fine, but there's plenty of other stuff, you know, and you can just pick a little bit of this and pick a little bit of that. You know, that's the great thing about anthology collections is it gives you an opportunity as a reader to sample a bunch of different voices from
Mm,
writers you might not have experienced before, and also as like from an editorial standpoint, it's a great place to kind of road test writers. Say, you
yeah.
know, can this person sustain a story? Do the readers like them? And then, you know, maybe open a door later on to that person doing something that's a longer form.
Oh, so good. I love it. I love it. Well, but let's get back to Space Marines because the last I heard of the Alpha Legion was in Dan's Legion. They're all skullduggery around. But I wasn't quite convinced that they would become Horus supporters until page 88. If anyone had been in the room with Mendax as he moved, they might have briefly glimpsed an icon tattooed on the inside of his forearm. In green ink, the symbol of the mythic Hydra, its tail raised and three heads rearing back in fanged defiance. And I was like, oh! And then right at the end, we have the moment when we realize it's an Alpha Legion. You will not succeed, spat the Psyker. I know what you are. I see the brand. Alpha Legion. She pointed to his arm where a tattoo protruded from his sleeve. You're the tool of monsters and turncoats. A liar, a walking falsehood. And I just thought that really summed up the Alpha Legion, what I've learned of them. But also, James Swallow's perfect to write the Alpha Legion. Like, yes, Blood Angels, but you're not a liar or a monster, but you're so good at writing, the tricksy spy characters and that subterfuge. And I was thinking, God, it really made sense. Of course, Mendax would turn out to be Alpha Legion because you can just, you can get into the minds of the really crafty people. So, did you know that you were going to be able to pop that character in, or were they like, did you have free choice? How did Mendax come to be part of Alpha Legion?
Well, I mean, he's not a space marine. You've got to make that clear to anybody who hasn't read the story. He's like an
Yes,
op.
sorry, Legion, sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, he's, you know, but the thing about you know, you say about the Alpha Legion, obviously they are the trixiest of the brotherhoods, and they're not because they are spies and assassins and, masters of subterfuge. Not everybody who works for them is going to be a space marine because you see those guys coming a mile off, right? And
Yes.
if you're going to do espionage, you need people who can blend. So Mendax he's just really he doesn't really have any special abilities and by that I mean like kind of like maybe he might have the odd implant or something, but he's not superhuman, super strong. He's just really smart and he's very perceptive and he's got this clinical psychological way of looking at a group of people and going, I can exploit your weaknesses. That's his superpower, is
Yeah.
knowing what buttons to push, and he's in service to the Alpha Legion. So the Alpha Legion's only got so many Space Marines, and those guys are out sort of like mostly fighting secret battles somewhere. But there's like 10 times as many guys like Mendax, just one dude in a little spaceship being sent out to these different planets. Go to that planet and just mess with people and turn them, turn the dial of them towards Horus, and then off you go to the next planet. And Mendax talks about having done this a dozen times already, and he's going to do it a dozen times more. And that's all he does, goes from planet to planet and just screws with them one after the other. And that, to me, that's a pure Alpha Legion thing, because that's what they're all about. They're all
Yeah.
about the dark, hidden war underneath, the war of information, the war of hearts and minds.
Mm.
That's what the Alpha Legion do. And so when I was writing this story, I don't think at the beginning I had a kind of conscious thought about who it would be. I think at the beginning I was actually going to just kind of say he was just an agent of Horus.
Yeah.
And I thought it just seems like a missed opportunity to go, no, it dovetails perfectly with the ideas. Yeah, of course he would be Alpha Legion. Of
Yeah.
course it would be them, because that's what they do best. So that's the direct connection right there, is he's got that brand on the inside of his arm.
Yeah.
And most people probably wouldn't even know what it means. But the psyker, she sees it, and like she says, I know what that is. I know who you are. But
Yeah.
she's the only one who recognizes him from the start as to be what he is. But she's in no position to do anything about it. And by
No.
the time she's like, I'm going to stop you, he's like, no, you're not. This it's already done. The war's
Yeah.
already. I'm going to move on to the next one now.
Crikey, the ending. Yeah. Yes. The poor psycho. But I mean, I absolutely love it. The fact that you realize, yeah, this is definitely someone attached to the Alpha Squad. They are, all of those things. I really think they should probably give you a book on the Alpha Legion. Just saying, just putting it out into the universe, because a lot of your literature, I'm overjoyed to be on your mailing list, because free writing that's just as bloody twisty and turny, and then you're like, oh my God, when is the next email coming? But yeah, I just think, I was watching the Ipcress file the other night, and I've always loved what's his name, John le Carre, and I think I'd probably put you up there in
Oh, I
terms.
don't know. That's high praise indeed. But I'm happy to be spoken of in the same sentence as somebody as like exalted and top of their game like that guy was.
Well, someone wrote a comment on my YouTube channel yesterday, and they wrote, "Why are the Warhammer community sleeping on Mira's YouTube channel? She gets access to so many authors." Firstly, I thought that must be a young person, because sleeping on something is a very young, cool expression. But I really think if anybody's watching this who doesn't realize they're sleeping on one of the best spy writers, or kind of like, I don't know how to describe you. That's a terrible way of describing you. But I
Okay.
think you are great. I think you have a mastery over that type of literature. And it can't help to what I've read of you, it comes in such an organic way. Yes, there's the quality of you as a fantastic writer, but everything just kind of makes sense when you look at it backwards. So I'm just letting the people know that I think you're up there with the greats in spy writing. So
Thank,
yeah,
thank
I'm
you very
allowed to say that about you. I
I'm I'm
obviously,
I'm blushing, but thank you very much. That's really nice of you to say that. And certainly I think it's true that looking back now with sort of 10 years of distance between me and this story, yeah, I can definitely see myself pushing at trying to express that idea is like, I'd like to write some spy fiction, so maybe I can do it here in this world of the Warhammer universe, and trying to make those two things kind of dovetail together. So it's
Yeah.
definitely, yeah, that story is definitely a very early expression of my desire to do, spy and espionage stories.
Well, I going to overuse the word, but I think we're really lucky. And we've spoken in previous interviews about your influences and where your writing has taken you. And I think it's that richness that adds so much to it as well. So you don't just get this spy storyline, you get the classic sci-fi influences, and then, even as you're describing the Western, influence, and there's just so much from the mishmash of you growing up in that little flat with everything smushed together that we get in a Ribena shot, that we're
Yeah.
so lucky. And oh gosh, again, this was meant to be a short chat. We're at 42 minutes in, but we'll just go a little bit longer if that's okay.
Oh, sure.
Yes, the I just wanted to talk about the ending. So the ending is a real, if you're this far ahead, you're spoilers. So Mendax has successfully caused this town to kind of massacre each other. Yes, and really great descriptions of a township, like amateurs basically kicking the crap out of each other, but lots of kind of off the screen violence as well. It's imagined, which I was grateful for. And then the poor astropath has to just send a message saying Mendax has succeeded. Mendax shoots off into the sky after delivering this truth bomb. And poor Leon is like, oh my gosh, how could you do this? And, Mendax is like, saying, I am a liar. Like, this is exactly who I am. This is exactly what I stand for. I made their sky fall. And then Leon realizes everything falls away from him. And it ends. Leon Kiter leaned forward and let his forehead touch the cold glassaic of the armored viewport. His hands played palm open either side of his face. He looked down, not daring to glance towards the threatening dark, watching the agri world beneath him. Night covered the landscape, but there was light here and there in scattered bands and broken commas of colour. Light from the fires of burning towns, yellow, orange, and hellish in shade, falling everywhere he turned his gaze. In the cold and the silence, Leon watched the distant flames spread. Oh my goodness.
That poor kid, he has that moment right at the end when he has that moment, one moment of bravery where he suddenly realizes that he's been played all the way through,
Hmm.
and he tries to be the hero, but it's too late. And that's the great tragedy of the story. You say he's a good kid and he's learned the right lessons from like his adulation of the Space Marines about all the stuff about nobility and heroism. But he
Yeah,
comes to it just too late. And because he's just a little boy, there isn't anything he can do about it. And he's again, the Horus Heresy is always a story about tragedy. And this is a story about tragedy. The
yeah,
villain wins.
yeah,
And we end that story with Leon looking down, like you say, at the planet, and he sees not just his own town, but every town.
yeah,
They've all fallen to the same kind of lies. They've all turned on each other. And he has that sort of terrible moment of understanding is that, you can think what's going on through his mind is how is it that people are so easily manipulated? It's a very much a moment of him being forced to mature and see something, a very adult viewpoint for a kid
yeah.
in that situation. And he's going to go home. And I think there's a bit where Mendak says to him, he says, I'm going to stop you. And Mendak says, no, you're not. You're going to go home.
Hmm.
And if you're lucky, they won't be waiting to kill you when you get back. If you're lucky, you might survive this. That's the best you're going to get. Is
Yeah,
you might possibly be able to survive because your planet is so kind of isolated is no one will pay any attention to it as long as you
yeah,
just like you salute Horus's flag instead of the Emperor's, you'll be fine.
yeah. I mean,
But you have to give up all this stuff that you believe in, and that's the terrible truth that this kid has to face.
yeah, I mean, I was really taken, I had to reread the ending a couple of times, and I thought it was this really beautiful, as you said earlier, like an echo of Leon is observing his planet, trails of fires everywhere, and this guy's gone off to do the same again. And it's, brother turning against brother, and that is the microcosm of that's that's what we're in now. It's a civil war across the universe, a story which is being echoed out again and again. And also with, the realization landing that we're now moving from whatever this was to a state of it will be like you may or you may not survive. So I just thought, I mean, I was really cross with you, obviously, but
Good.
yeah, I thought it was a really beautiful ending, and I was surprised in such a short amount of time that you've been rooting so much for Leon, and I was thinking, well, maybe maybe he'll come back, and it's like, Mira, it's not a Marvel movie. I just thought it was really beautiful. I think the ending really gave me that sense of that I was talking about, the ennui, the understanding of where your place is in the universe. You're a tiny planet, but yeah, what a beautiful journey and just a one short story.
I
Yeah,
wanted I wanted it to have that kind of bleakness at the end because I remember I did consider a different ending, and I thought about what if Leon shoots him at the end. Leon kills Mendax. Like Mendax doesn't think, you're just a silly little boy, and Leon picks up the gun and shoots him.
yeah.
And I thought there was one version of that story where it plays out, Leon, the gun goes off, Mendax goes, "Oh my God, you shot me in the heart." And as he's coughing up blood and dying, he's like, "Oh, well done, you did something heroic, but it still won't matter
Yes.
because your planet's still going to burn. And even if I'm dead, someone else will take my place." And then, and so there was a version I was going to end it where it ends with, Leon standing over Mendax's body with a smoking gun. And then
Yeah.
that to me, I know it sounds weird to say this because Leon loses his innocence at the end of the story, but that felt like a step too far to have Leon kill somebody and
Mm,
become like kind of literally a participant in the war, in the violence. I wanted him to be untouched by that. So that everything that happens to that kid is it happens to him. He's not the instigator of it. And I didn't want to change that at the end. So I decided that in the end, I went for the kind of what to me felt like the bleaker ending, which is
mm.
where he has to kind of go back and live with what's happened and also with the knowledge of it because he's the only one who's going to go
Very
home
nice.
who knows what actually happened and no one will believe him. And to me that felt like the bleaker ending. That felt like the more Warhammer ending. So that's why I chose to go down that path instead.
Yeah. Well, I think you definitely made the right decision. And at least Leon is still pure
Yeah, yeah.
in his own way. But yeah, thank you so much, James, for this lovely, lovely story.
My
And
pleasure.
yeah, it's always so good to chat to you about all these things. Thank you for coming back on my channel. I'm not sure when I meet you again in the the heresy. But I regularly get people begging for me to talk to you about Blood Angels. So I think I'm going to try and have to get to the Blood Angels at summer at some point and be with you then.
Yeah, well, I'd always love to come back. It's so much fun to really. I don't get the opportunity to kind of get into the weeds about this stuff. Is to talk about like the inspirations and
Yeah.
and the places where my head is at, and then I go back to these books that I wrote like a decade ago, and I've forgotten about it, and I reread it and go like, oh yeah, that's what I was thinking at that time. So
Yeah. It's quite
in
good,
a way.
this, what I wrote.
It's like almost having a conversation with a younger version of myself and like going, oh, hey, old man, this is what I was doing then. Oh, really? And
Yeah.
it's
But
interesting for me to see the evolution of my own writing in that material.
yeah, well, and also to be told that, just to big you up a little bit, because I think when
Yeah,
you're in the hurly-burly of having to write and write, it was good for someone to say, stop, you're really good at this bit. But also, it was so lovely, viewers won't know, but we got to catch up at Dragon Meet, and we were just as excited to talk about all other things. And then you did a reading to me from one of your books about quite a moment that happens in the heresy. And having the author read a portion of the book that excites them that they got to write it. I can't believe that happened to me. And you left our Game Therapy UK stand, and one of my fellow volunteers was like, "Was that James Swallow? Did he just read to you from his book?" And we were like, "So, yeah, that was really fantastic. I hope I bump into you again at another convention." You
well,
know,
I'm sure if we don't see each other anytime soon, probably next Dragon Meet. If I'm
yeah,
away from Dragon Meet,
yeah,
so if it's another year away, yeah, I'll definitely see you there.
Yay. Well, let's say goodbye now for the video and everything, and then I'll stay on and we can say goodbye properly. James, thank you so much for coming to my channel, and we'll speak to you again soon.
Thank you, Mira, and thanks everybody for watching. Hope you enjoyed it.
Yay. Bye. Okay. Uh.
James.